As you can clearly see, we've made some huge strides on this thing since the last video. I mean, this thing is really coming together now. We made some tremendous progress. There's not a lot left to do to it. A few odds and ends to finish up, a little fine tuning, a couple little bugs to work out, and this thing should be ready to go. So we've got a little bit less than 3 weeks to go now, and I don't see any issues in getting this thing finished up. I mean, this thing will be on the road in no time, right? I am so screwed.
Citizens of the Earth, you will be destroyed.
As I mentioned in one of the previous videos, my original plan was to try to do a cross tier setup on this. So right now it has 37 to 41 round back spindles on it. I've since given up on that idea. There's just not enough time and room to get that thing set up in there. So we're going to go back to a side steer, which means I need to get rid of these spindles, go back to the 32 to 34 spindles that were on this axle originally. I also need to put new bushings and hopefully find some kingpins that'll work in there. On top of that, when you do adapt to the later brakes to those early spindles, the bolt holes aren't the same, the inside diameter isn't the same, so there's a kit to adapt that. Hopefully that works. So we're gonna get these things torn off, hopefully get that stuff together, and maybe by the end of the night have the front end back together. Who knows? Alright, so we've got our 32 to 34 spindles up on the bench here. I think these are actually the ones that came off of that axle. They're actually in pretty good shape. The big thing is that the steering balls are in good shape. A lot of times these get out of round. These all feel pretty good, so we'll clean them up. I'm not even going to bother taking them off. Just put new seals on them. Clean up the rest of this gunk. The kingpins are garbage. Unfortunately, the bottoms are all worn out. So it's going to need new kingpins and bushings. It's not a huge deal. We'll get the old bearings and everything else off of here and get this cleaned up. While we're right here and have these handy, let's do a quick look at some differences in kingpins, because this is going to be fairly important depending on how you match things up. Now the axles from 28 to 48 are all the same. They don't care what you put for spindles and kingpins. The spindle does care what you have for a kingpin, and they have to match. So if we look at these, this is a 32, this is a 35. They're fairly similar. So the basic design is the same from 28 up through 35. And in that design, they use the bearing set on top of the spindle like this. In 37, that changed to where the bearing now set between the axle and the spindle down towards the bottom, so it would have been down in here. And you can see because of that, they changed the location of the lock pin. So if you line these up, that notch no longer lines up. So you cannot use these later pins with earlier spindles. Any of these kingpins, 28 to 35, will fit 28 to 35 spindles. However, the cups are different depending on what you run for actuators in your brakes. So this is a 32 kingpin, and these are commonly confused with Model A's. They are not the same, even though a lot of people seem to think they are. So the difference is, a Model A, this face is parallel to this notch. In a 32 to 34, they're not. This notch is actually tilted 15 degrees because the face of this is at an angle for the actuator, which sits at an angle. You try to use this on a Model A setup or vice versa, you'll be able to get it together all fine, except your lock bolt won't fit. So what I think we're going to have to do with this one is I'm going to run these 35 pins just because I have a new set laying around. I pick up NOS sets on eBay when they go cheap. The 35 and 6s really aren't very desirable, so you can usually get these pretty damn cheap. Now with this setup, obviously we're not going to be using the cup, so I think I'm probably going to have to cut it off right about here, clean that up, that way it'll clear the wheel cylinder. So as I have said in pretty much every other video I've done that had anything to do with anything with grease fittings, when it's out on the bench, now is the time to check them or replace them. It's never going to be easier to get at them. So now here comes the fun part of pressing the bushings in and making sure they actually go in there straight. They can go in crooked, they're pretty soft, and they can deform and get all messed up when you try to put them in. And when you go to cut them, they don't cut correctly. So make sure they go in there straight. Also make sure that this hole lines up with the grease fitting, otherwise you're never going to get grease in it and they're going to last like 3 weeks. So once you get it started straight, you can press them in with a vise. If you can't seem to get it started straight, you can rig up something like this, just a bolt with some spacers and dingers. You can use it to kind of square things up and push it down in there that way if you need to. Alright, so I've got all 4 bushings pressed in. When you put these things in, you need to make sure that they don't protrude from the top or into the middle where the axle is. The bottom doesn't matter, it will stick out of the bottom, but it can't stick out of any of these because it'll throw off the setup of the kingpin. If you plan on reaming your own bushings, find an old reamer. They do sell new ones. All the Model A parts distributors sell new ones. However, they're not made correctly. This end isn't small enough. So the idea with this is that this is small enough to slide through the bushing. So this will locate the reamer in the bottom bushing before you cut anything. And it'll start to cut the top bushing with this. As you cut the top bushing to size, it will then slide down into the bottom. This will guide the reamer in the top bushing that is now cut to size. And this will now cut the bottom one. The problem with the new ones is this end is too large and it won't drop down through. So I have a new one and I've been using that right along. So what I've had to do is take a hone and bring that top bushing up to size to be able to slip this through. That's not how these are supposed to work. So it took me a while to find one. This is actually an old one, and I believe it's NOS. I don't think it's ever been used. So if you just keep an eye on eBay, occasionally they show up. This is definitely what you want. It makes it a lot quicker to use the correct reamer. So now you can see what I was talking about, where this drops down through that first one. And now it sits into that bottom one to align this. The new ones don't do that. So when you do this, you want to oil the hell out of it. You also want a good bunch of oil on this. While you're cutting it, continuously oil it. It's very important to keep these things from getting dull. Another thing to point out is that this style does not have any sort of a stop on it. Some of them I think do. So if you're cutting and you get down through the bottom bushing, when you're done cutting that, this will just fall through. So either be ready to catch it, or smart to put a rag or a box or something down on the floor so that way if it does fall through, this doesn't smash into the floor and destroy it. So I've seen people use ratchets on these. The problem with that is you're kind of torquing it in one direction. I took a couple of junk Chinese wrenches and welded them together. And it kind of makes a nice double handle here, so you can actually put a rotational force on it instead of a sideways force. So. Like I said, lots of oil. You don't really need to push down on it, just keep spinning it, it'll do the work. You see it just drops. I think it's actually going to run into the table. I may have to readjust that. That's better. So now it's going to drop and cut the bottom. Try to get some of the shavings out of there if you can. Make sure you get some oil in that. Now's where you got to be careful, because if you aren't prepared for it, it's going to drop once it's done cutting this. And just like that. What's nice about this is it'll start to cut with this on the bottom, so this actually blows right through the bottom really fast. So as you saw, it only took like 5 turns to go through the bottom one. So this is really quick. This thing works 1,000 times better than that new one did. So try to find one of these old ones. Also, I wasn't really thinking with the whole grease fittings thing, because now I need to take those back out, clean out the holes, because there's going to be metal shavings in there, and obviously you don't want that pumping in there. So pop those out, clean that hole out good, put them back in there. It should be ready to go. So obviously now it's a good time to double check, make sure that the reamed out bushings actually fit the kingpins. As I mentioned, I try to always buy old NOS kingpins. At least you know they're usually made correctly. Some of the newer ones, I think they're better now, but some of the newer ones for a while there were actually made at the wrong size, so you ream these out and these would actually be too big for the too small of kingpin. The only downside to buying NOS ones is usually the bearings are junk. These things usually have a little bit of surface rust on them, or just corrosion. The bearings usually get rusty inside and you have to throw them away. So just plan on replacing the bearings. But everything else in the kit is usually good. Once you clean these up a little bit with a Scotch-Brite pad, they're usually good to go. So it fits in there just perfectly. As you can see here, how much larger the hole in the backing plate is, but you can also see the bolt holes don't line up. So you need to oblong all these holes towards the inside like that to make them line up. So that's a little bit time consuming, a little bit of a pain. Then you slip that piston ring thing inside of here and fight with it and swear at it for a while and try to get it up onto this thing without it spitting out of here. They're kind of a pain. But once you get it on there, it will work. The other issue you run into is the kingpin. And depending on where your hose ends up, you may have to cut this cup off or at least grind away at it to clearance it, because your brake hose comes out in that area and we'll probably run into that. These later drums don't use this grease baffle. They use an actual seal, so we're going to get in here with a screwdriver and pop that off of there. So I've got it roughly put together here. We got the holes all elongated on the backing plate. So I just elongated the holes on the backing plate and not the spindle. And you can see right here, there's very, very little left of a lip on the backing plate. This is actually that ring that comes with the kit. This is the spindle, this is the ring, this is the backing plate, and there's very, very little left there. Well, that's not an ideal situation. That's pretty much what you have to do to make those fit. You can see where those holes line up. That's just how it is. That's the only way this is going to work. It's been done a bunch of times. I've never heard of anyone having any issues with it. So, with that in there, it captures the plate pretty good. It captures the ring to hold that in place. And the way I went about doing this, and I'll show it in just a second, but I took a file. You can do this with a burr or whatever you have available. I just used a coarse file, and it went fairly quickly. But I just bring all the holes really, really close to the edge, like again, like that one looks. And then I get it all fit together. And once I can get one of the holes to line up so I can put a bolt through it, bolt it together, and then work off the other ones. That way you know it's where it needs to be, and you're not making the holes any bigger than they absolutely have to be. So once you get it bolted together, just tighten that up, just finger tight, and work them one at a time till you can slide a bolt in all of them. Well, I didn't film a whole lot yesterday, so I'll give you a little update on what we got done. Justin came up to help out for most of the day, so we got a bunch of stuff done. Front end's pretty much wrapped up. We got the brakes all together. Kingpins all set up. Got the wheels that I painted up. The front tires thrown on there, just some 600s. Much to my surprise, the kingpins actually fit fine with the hydraulic brakes. I kind of assumed I'd have to at least grind the head or cut the head off of that, but you can see it clears the hose with quite a bit of room. Obviously clears the bleeder just fine. So that was a nice surprise. Got the tie rod all on. Again, these are the 32 to 34 spindles. Went back to those. Got new bushings in those. So this is pretty much wrapped up. I think I'm going to have to knock a couple leaves out of the front. I put 10 back in it thinking that the weight of that engine would squat it down quite a bit, and it really didn't. So we'll probably rip a few out of there and see how that sits, but that's not high priority right at the moment. But everything else seems to fit pretty good. We can run these up. I'll punch a hole in the frame up in here somewhere. Those should fit just fine. So we're coming along.